I can't tell you how much I work with my students to try to get them to read Scripture. I sometimes think the biblical illiteracy comes because we read Scripture so boringly. Yeah, so thank you for bringing it to life. Yeah. And thank you for the introduction, Dean Sterling, and thank you for the invitation, and thanks to the faculty for the invitation to give these lectures. I appreciate very much your giving me the opportunity and trusting me with the responsibility. It's a great honor, and I appreciate it very much. I also want to thank Lynn Haverset. I don't know if she's here or not. She's made all the arrangements, helped me with the travel and the hotel, and any of you who do these kinds of things know if somebody's handling all that nicely, it's wonderful. You can focus on the things you're supposed to focus on. So I'm grateful for all the effort she has put in. I also want to thank all of you for being here. You could be doing a lot of other things, but you've come to listen to me talk. So I appreciate that very much. And I'm looking forward through the week to more conversation and probably some critique and all of that. So I'm looking forward to our time together. Finally, I want to thank Dana, my wife. We've been married for 41 years. You go through a lot in 41 years. It may seem like 60 to her. But if I tried to thank her for specifics, I wouldn't have any lecture time left. So I'm just going to say thank you for everything. You know. Well, it's come to this. I've been preaching for right at 30 years, and I've arrived at the grotesque. But the reason may surprise you. I've arrived at this point not because the thousands of sermons I have listened to have been grotesque, not at all. Rather, I've arrived here because most of the sermons I hear have not taken the grotesque seriously enough. The pulpit, it seems, tend not simply to neglect, but at times to resist the grotesque. And I'm interested in that. I've done this myself, not only in my preaching, but in my writing. For many years now, I have focused on the folly of the gospel. I've spent more hours than I probably should have studying holy fools and jesters and tricksters and carnival. And the whole time around all of that, the language of the grotesque, the imagery of the grotesque have been there, taunting me, troubling me. But I've avoided the grotesque, resisted it. It seemed too shocking, too unnerving, not to mention far too huge to tackle, rearing its head as it does, it seems, in every area of art and life. So I just stuck with foolishness. It was a lot less disturbing and a whole lot more fun. But the words of the classical pianist Elena Grimou have unsettled me. In a magazine article I read a while back, she said she admired musicians who dared to play their conception all the way to the end. And I have realized that folly is not the end. Indeed, it seems to me now that as valuable as folly can be, it can also be a way of sanitizing the grotesque and the gospel, making both of them less scandalous, more palatable. So this week, I want to make, in Karl Barth's phrase, a provisional attempt to explore some aspects of the grotesque and their implications for preaching. To put these lectures in the context of the Beecher lectures, I propose that Frederick Buechner just left out a genre. Like many in my generation, I cut my homiletical teeth on Buechner's lectures, which he published as Telling the Truth, the Gospel as Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. I don't know how many times I've read that book, including a couple more preparing for this. But I now suspect a genre was missing. He probably only had 3 lectures, so there you have it. The gospel as grotesque. So if it's not too presumptuous, I offer these lectures as a modest addendum, not a substitute, but a modest addendum to Buechner's, though certainly without his literary flair. Blackwater is an award-winning Swedish crime novel by Kerstin Ekman. Any fans of Scandinavian crime fiction here? We'll talk later. Okay. Early in the novel, one of the central characters, Annie, endures a chaotic and ultimately horrifying day. Following a lengthy train ride and a grueling bus trip, Annie arrives overheated and exhausted with her 5-year-old daughter in the small village of Blackwater. She finds herself in a strange place among people she doesn't know. She's an outsider, and folks are suspicious of her. She's ill at ease from the beginning. Her lover was supposed to meet her and take her to their destination, an isolated community deep in the forest. But he never shows up, which sows its own kind of concern and confusion. So all throughout the midsummer night, she wanders lost in the shadowy forest through a maze of paths, stinging insects, and tangled marshy undergrowth, always concerned about her anxious and tearful daughter. But she never finds the community. The entire experience is deeply disorienting. After hours of wandering, she suddenly comes upon a grisly murder scene. It's a crime novel. That's going to happen. The sight makes her physically sick and her knees buckle. As she breaks her fall, her hands go right into the blood, which she instinctively wipes all over her skirt before finally washing her hands in a creek. And she and her daughter continue wandering, lost. Now, under the gruesome shadow of the murder, not to mention her awareness that a killer is in the area, whom she thinks she might have actually seen. Her entire experience is described in excruciating detail. Even the reader becomes disoriented. Later, because she has witnessed the murder scene, Annie is taken to a home where she is questioned by a detective in the kitchen. Ekman writes this about the interrogation. For the rest of her life, Annie was to preserve the memory of that walk. But how much of it would she have remembered if the detective had not forced her to describe it over and over again in that warm kitchen? There must be tangled events, illogical or utterly insane actions in all our lives to forget. They refused to allow her to forget. They forced her to bind them together into a pattern. But it was a false pattern. It was a false pattern. That short sentence really is extraordinary in a crime novel. I mean, for while good crime fiction may do many different things, crime novels are ultimately about discerning patterns. They're about restoring order. Crime novels are in a real sense narratives in search of some narrative resolution to the crime that has disrupted the order of things. But Ekman here undercuts the entire genre, not to mention her own novel. The pattern the detective demanded was inadequate to Annie's experience. It was a false pattern. So what does that mean about the solution to the murder at the end of the novel? Is that too a false pattern? Is that final pattern also imposed on experiences that are too complex to be captured in a neat narrative? I suspect that many preachers, including myself, frequently function as crime novelists. Oh, we may tolerate disruption in our sermons for a little while, but usually we're after that resolution. We're after that restoration of order, even if that is a word of hope far off in the future. We seek to discern a pattern, a narrative, a doctrine that will provide some clarity, some structure. One of the questions we preaching teachers often ask, some of you students may have heard it, is this: where is the good news in your sermon? It's an important question. But all too often, I fear it really means something like, where is the resolution? Where is the restoration of order? Indeed, entire homiletical theories have been structured around a move from problem to solution, from disorientation to reorientation, from scratch to itch. And I wonder if this model hasn't often become the homiletical default setting, even for purportedly more open-ended sermons. But I also wonder how often we impose false patterns. I wonder if the gospel and life really lend themselves neatly to many of our theological and homiletical patterns. In her recent memoir about her experience with cancer, my colleague Kate Bowler challenges the false and inadequate patterns we Christians often impose on those with serious illness. She explores many of these in her book, but the title of her memoir makes the point. Everything happens for a reason, and other lies I've loved. That's an important reminder to preachers. Have you ever noticed, for example, and I'm guilty, have you ever noticed how often preachers just throw out the C word, cancer? Just throw it out there whenever we need a seemingly horrible experience to address with the gospel? Just throw out the word as if the experience of cancer were easily summed up in a single term. But as Bowler reminds us, there's no such thing as cancer. Every cancer is different. Every experience is different. And it's doubtful that even caring pastors fully understand these experiences. The loved ones and the patients themselves may not even understand. Applying a general pattern to cancer from the pulpit probably results in a false pattern for many, many people. The poet Gregory Orr reports a similar experience. When he was 12 years old, he accidentally shot and killed his younger brother Peter in a hunting accident. In the hours following the incident, everyone tried to comfort him by imposing a pattern on what had happened. The Christian pattern was possibly the worst. You should know that right now Peter is in heaven with Jesus, someone said. It may not make sense now, but it's all part of God's plan. In response to those comments, Orr felt only rage and despair. I wanted to scream at her, he wrote in his memoir. What is wrong with you? Didn't you see his body? Don't you know what happened? Don't you know he's dead? This isn't Sunday school. My brother was just killed by a bullet and I fired it. What kind of nonsense are you talking? And that day, Orr rejected conventional religion for the rest of his life. Who can blame him? His mother also tried to comfort him by telling him that his father had once killed someone in a hunting accident too. I've done similar things. Some of you probably have too. And here's what Orr writes reflecting on that. Certainly that coincidence represented some mysterious, even supernatural pattern. But who could imagine it being a happy pattern? The pattern that showed there was a God, and God cared about us humans. False patterns. That's where the grotesque comes in. You were wondering if I was going to get there, weren't you? For the grotesque fundamentally disrupts our familiar patterns. Patterns we often use to make sense of life. As Robert Penn Warren put it, the grotesque is one of the most obvious forms art may take to pierce the veil of familiarity, to stab us from the drowse of the accustomed, to make us aware of the perilous paradoxicality of life. Or as Flannery O'Connor has argued, the grotesque takes us through the surface of life and pushes us toward mystery and the unexpected. It combines wild discrepancies and pushes us toward mystery with unsettling distortions in order to take us to the depths of life where our previous understanding is no longer adequate. The grotesque, to put it another way, shocks us out of our comfortable patterns, including those we may rely on in the pulpit. And isn't that what the gospel does as well? Isn't that deep down the scandal, the offense of the gospel? Piercing the veil of familiarity, making us aware of the perilous paradoxicality of life, taking us through the surface of life toward mystery and the unexpected, shocking us out of our comfortable and false patterns. The scandal of the gospel may simply be that it is grotesque. So we need to look for Jesus down in the grotto, where, according to most scholars, the concept of the grotesque actually emerged. Indeed, the term grotesque comes from an Italian phrase meaning work or painting found in a grotto. Grotto-esque. The reference is to grottos in ancient Roman buildings that were excavated at the end of the 15th century and revealed fanciful, disorienting murals. The art in the grottos was radically at odds with the norms of clarity, balance, and harmony presumed to be features of a classical aesthetic. The murals instead imaged a chaotic combination of incongruous and contradictory elements. Beasts were fused with animal bodies. Figures like the centaur combined human and non-human elements. Human and animal heads grew out of plants, all with a seemingly wild and uncontrolled exuberance. The murals presented unsettling, disorienting hybrids that transgressed accepted categories. They distorted what was considered normal and beautiful. They messed with accepted patterns. They were, as they came to be called, grotesque. Gargoyles often represent this aspect of the grotesque, including some of them here at Yale. Check out the gargoyles at the Sterling Law Building with their human bodies and animal heads. Then there are the gargoyles of the Yale, that mythical creature composed of an array of strange and incongruous body parts. I'm sure you know that one. But you can see the gargoyles of it at Davenport and Timothy Dwight colleges. There's even a book about the gargoyles at Yale that's entitled An Education in the Grotesque. You don't even need my lectures. You can just walk around campus. Many terms have been used to describe the grotesque. One list includes the following: peculiar, odd, absurd, bizarre, macabre, depraved, degenerate, perverse. These descriptions and many others all have their place in the history of the grotesque. But the murals in the grotto continue to supply one central aspect that runs throughout understandings of the grotesque in its various forms. The grotesque in art and literature and photography and architecture and life embodies contradictions, incongruities. It engages in radical, at times shocking, hybrid forms that subvert dominant categories and resist resolution. The grotesque is composed, as someone put it, of discombobulating juxtapositions and bizarre combinations that open up an indeterminate space of conflicting possibilities, images, and figures. The grotesque trades in paradoxical anomalies and transgresses binaries and crosses classificatory boundaries. As a result, the grotesque usually involves both a subversion of the status quo and, in the words of Mikhail Bakhtin, the potentiality of another world, another order, another way of life. As should be evident, the grotesque is inseparable from context. The murals in the grotto were certainly not viewed as grotesque when they were created. The figures in them probably didn't seem incongruous or contradictory at all. They simply represented a different symbolic or metaphorical system. But in the context of different aesthetic norms, when they were discovered, they became grotesque. As the Polish artist Ewa Kieruluk writes, the meaning of the grotesque is constituted by the norm which it contradicts, the order it destroys, the values it upsets, the authority and morality it derides, the religion it ridicules, the harmony it breaks up, the heaven it brings down to earth, the position of classes and races and sexes that it reverses, the beauty and goodness it questions. The word grotesque makes sense only if one knows what the norm represents in art and in life. Not surprisingly, any genre as subversive and unstable as the grotesque will generate a wide variety of responses. For some, usually those who benefit from the norms, the grotesque is ominous and threatening. It inspires terror and fear. Keep it away. It opens the space for sinister invaders of the familiar world, as someone has put it. Think of some of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, many of which he called tales of the grotesque. For others, usually those oppressed or excluded by the norms, the grotesque can be a liberating means of resistance. It can be something joyful and life-giving, something to celebrate. More often than not, however, responses to the grotesque are themselves contradictory and incongruous. They include both repulsion and attraction, revulsion and fascination, horror and laughter, anxiety and liberation, all at the same time. Much like the responses that must have been elicited by another ancient Roman work of art, one I'm sure many of you know, the familiar Alexamenos Graffito. It's a piece of Roman graffiti scratched in the plaster of a wall near the Palatine Hill in Rome. The image shows a figure with an ass's head and a human body hanging from a cross. In front of the figure stands a young man, presumably Alexamenos, raising his hand as if in prayer. Across the picture is written in broad strokes, Alexamenos worships his God. A piece of graffiti takes Jesus down into the grotto. The image subverts normative categories. It joins elements that simply don't belong together. The divine, the human, the animal, all hanging together from a cross, a place where God is surely absent. Yet, Alexamenos worships the figure as God. Not surprisingly, the graffiti mocks this impossible mixture of categories, revealing just how incongruous and contradictory these dizzying combinations really are. The divine, human, the non-human, hanging from a cross. It's repulsive and fascinating. It's disgusting and comical. It's scandalous. It's offensive. It's grotesque. But in a profound sense, it's gospel. It's gospel. And therein lies the challenge for preaching and for theology. The crucifixion is grotesque not simply because it is gruesome and horrifying, though it is. Rather, the crucifixion is grotesque because it is marked by irresolvable contradictions. Contradictions the church has spent millennia tying itself in knots, trying to form into a pattern. The divine human one, or the human divine one hanging from a cross, Tomorrow I will add the non-human, which we usually ignore. Crucified Messiah, crucified Lord, crucified God. Those are incommensurable realities. The shocking incongruities exploded the dominant cultural categories. They subverted the familiar patterns of power and wisdom and divinity. We should speak of the perilous paradoxicality of the cross. It was a scandal, an offense. It was grotesque. New Testament scholars have highlighted this character of crucifixion, even when they haven't used the term grotesque. Alexander Brown, for example, knows that Paul in 1 Corinthians preaches a scandalous gospel with unconventional, destabilizing pairings of opposites. He seeks to perceptually unbalance the church. Weak power, foolish wisdom, crucified Messiah, crucified Lord. You know chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians. Paul cannot preach with nice, neat patterns because he's trying to proclaim a grotesque gospel which resists normative rhetorical categories. Paul is actually a homiletics professor's nightmare. And not just because he needs serious work on issues of gender and sexuality and slavery, though he does. What are you going to say in a sermon conference with the apostle? Paul, I think you could use a little more clarity here. Let's see if you could come up with a nice, clear focus statement. Maybe that would help. You can't preach such an unsettling, contradictory word. You're throwing the congregation off balance. After all, look at how the Corinthians are responding. They think you're nuts. What the homiletics professor is really saying is something like this. You need to back off the grotesque gospel, Paul. You need to arrive at some resolution. A clear doctrine of the atonement would be very nice. Such discombobulating juxtapositions just won't preach. Roy Harrisville, another New Testament scholar, counters the homiletics professor with a jarring point. The cross, he says, fractures all of our rhetoric and theology. Paul, he writes, could not master his theology in any ultimate way because it never existed as a system. In fact, it could not, since the event at its core, crucifixion, spelled the death of system, or we might say the death of pattern. And Harrisville makes the same argument for all of the New Testament authors. As Richard Lisher put it concisely in his critique of narrative preaching, the cross is a catastrophe that interrupts all of our neat and settled narratives. The responses to crucifixion have also have the incongruous, paradoxical character of the grotesque. Terror and horror and revulsion are obvious aspects, I confess, that an emphasis on folly alone does not take seriously enough. But these responses merge with curiosity and fascination and even bloodthirst. Crucifixions, after all, drew a crowd. In the face of the grotesque cross, there's another response that is shocking. Laughter. Laughter. We see it in the mocking of Jesus present in the gospel accounts themselves, right? There were actually many crucifixion jokes. Yes, crucifixion jokes. And there were comedies depicting Christ's passion. Indeed, the Alexamenos Graffito was itself a kind of crucifixion joke. Monty Python's Life of Brian did not originate laughter at the cross. But this laughter took various forms. For those in power, the cross generated a kind of mocking laughter that reinforced the horrific instrument of execution through which the elites maintained their dominance. For the low and despised, those threatened by crucifixion, however, there was a kind of gallows humor that may have helped to blunt the horror of the punishment. But at the deepest level, there was what I would now call grotesque laughter. I didn't used to call it that, but I'm calling it that now. Such laughter expresses the disruptive inexpressible incongruities at the heart of the gospel. God, cross, life, death, repulsion, fascination, horror, hope. It is laughter that recognizes the impossibility of ever capturing or controlling the cross in human categories or systems or doctrines. It's the kind of laughter that, in the words of D. Diane Davis, breaks up our totalities, our patterns, our norms. As theologian Jacqueline Bussey writes, such laughter functions as an extra-linguistic resource for engaging a cross that is inherently paradoxical and resists expression in language. It is laughter in response to a gospel that remains scandalous and inscrutable. It is laughter in the face of the grotesque. Destabilizing pairings of opposites, fractured categories and norms, horror, revulsion, fascination, laughter. Crucifixion takes us into what historian Jeffrey Harprum has called the interval of the grotesque. In the interval of the grotesque, he argues, we recognize a number of the different forms in the object, but we have not yet developed a clear sense of how those elements are organized into a whole. Or in my terms, we haven't developed a sense of any pattern. The object, he writes, remains just out of focus, just beyond the reach of language. In this interval, as he puts it, the mind is poised between death and rebirth, insanity and discovery, rubble and revelation. I think that's the interval created by the gospel. It's the interval in which we now live as Christians, between death and rebirth, insanity and discovery, rubble and revelation. It's the interval in which the preacher lives. There's no avoiding it. For the event in which Christ identifies most deeply with humanity is a grotesque event of unresolved contradictions and incongruities. It embodies the perilous paradoxicality of human life. It cannot be forced into a nice, neat pattern. As a consequence, the Christian life itself is a hybrid life, a both-and life. A life in the interval in which the essential event of redemption is simultaneously a horrific event of violence and suffering. An event in which God is both scandalous and inscrutable. And that's what makes the Christian life grotesque. It's not just that the evil in the world lifted up in the crucifixion is so horrific, though it is. It's that as Christians we live in this deep, unresolved incongruity. The new creation we proclaim has interrupted the old age. But everywhere we look, we see crucified masses of human beings suffering beyond what many of us can even comprehend. And now in the face of climate change, all of humanity lives in the shadow of death. We live, as Kenneth Surin notes, simultaneously with a testimony of faithful affirmation and a testimony of that faith's negation. A testimony of faithful affirmation and a testimony of that faith's negation. And Jesus embodies all of those contradictions on his grotesque cross. A grotesque gospel presents a challenge for theology and preaching. Many of us don't want to live with the scandalous and inscrutable, even though we know that reality all too well. As a result, many of us try to force the gospel into our doctrines of the atonement, our theological systems, our homiletical theories, our patterns. We seek to get control of the contradictions. As Professor Jennings, whom I went to graduate school with, I'm sorry he's not here, has described academic theology. It flows, he writes, from an intellectual posture created through the cultivated capacities to clarify, categorize, define, and explain. This posture, he notes, eclipses theology's fluid, adaptable, even morphable character. But the grotesque gospel calls precisely for this fluid, adaptable, morphable character. Like the theologian Jennings describes, too many preachers, myself included, likewise rush too quickly to escape the interval of the grotesque. That's our purpose, isn't it? That's what we're supposed to do as preachers. Surely our goal is clarity, security, certainty. Give people a nice, focused nugget to carry home. Not the shocking, unresolved contradictions of a grotesque gospel. We preachers often seem to have a rage for order. But unlike the line in Wallace Stevens' poem, I'm no longer sure it's blessed. For when we rush to order, when we avoid the interval of the grotesque, our preaching may become shallow and unreal and cliched. We don't go deep enough. We're not honest enough. And we often end up falsifying both the gospel and life itself. We end up imposing false patterns. But the grotesque gospel often calls us preachers to relinquish, give up our familiar patterns. In his historical novel Silence, which has now been made into a movie a while back, Shusaku Endo depicts a descent, or is it an ascent, into the gospel as grotesque. The novel takes place in 17th century Japan, a time when Christians were undergoing extreme persecution in the country. Father Sebastian Rodriguez travels from Portugal to Japan as a Jesuit missionary. He's following his mentor, Father Ferrara, who has himself, to the horror of his students, apparently committed apostasy. Rodriguez begins his mission as an underground priest with a grand and beautiful ideal both of Christ and of the missionary. He looks down on those who would deny their faith and apostatize. As Jacqueline Bussey notes, and I'm drawing on her interpretation, Rodriguez begins his mission with clear either-or binary patterns. A person is strong or weak, honored or shamed, righteous or sinner, courageous or fearful, saved or condemned. Ultimately, either a believer or an apostate. Along the way, however, as he witnesses the torture of Christian peasants and faces the terror of torture himself, Rodriguez enters into the grotesque gospel. His neat categories all fall apart. His binaries no longer work. Nothing is as clear as he had thought. The martyrdoms he witnesses are not glorious, but horrifying and humiliating. Courage and strength alone do not define discipleship. Righteousness and sinfulness are not so easily distinguished. Finally, having been captured himself, Rodriguez is taken to the pit and brought before the fumi, the crucifix on which one steps to commit apostasy. As he stands above the fumi, he can hear the screams of others being tortured. And his captors tell him that if he steps on the fumi, if he commits apostasy, their torture will end. Their suffering will cease. It's a lie, of course, but that's what he's told. As he looks at Jesus' face on the fumi, it's no longer the beautiful face he had imagined, but an ugly, suffering face, worn down, concave from all the feet that have stepped on it. And finally, Jesus breaks his silence and speaks to Rodriguez for the very first time in the novel, toward the end. Trample, he says. I more than anyone know of the pain in your foot. It was to be trampled on by men that I was born into this world. It was to share men's pain that I carried my cross. And Rodriguez steps on the fumi. confronted with the suffering of the world and the incongruities of the cross, Rodriguez has to give up his old categories, his old patterns, including his understanding of weak and strong, faith and apostasy. He even has to give up his vocation. He is apostatized. But he nevertheless affirms that his faith remains. There's an unresolved resolution to the narrative. Rodriguez enters into the perilous paradoxicality of life and faith. At the moment of his apostasy, he may actually have been his most Christ-like, giving himself for the sake of others. Or is he simply justifying his apostasy, as some people claim? Rodriguez enters the interval between a testimony of faithful affirmation and a testimony of that faith's negation. He becomes, in Bussey's phrase, a believing apostate. A believing apostate, forever to live his life poised between death and rebirth, insanity and discovery, rubble and revelation. It's a condition, as Bussey points out, that generates laughter. It's shocking how much laughter runs through the novel, even at these points. It's grotesque laughter at a scandalous and inscrutable gospel. It also generates, for a homiletics professor, a telling comment about preaching. I know, Rodriguez reflects, that my Lord is different from the God that is preached in the churches. It's important to hear how Endo himself came to his theological insight. He listened, and you're going to hear this running through the lectures. Here's what he said. If the Christians of that era were to be divided into the weak and the strong, I would be among the former, the weak. History knows their sufferings. I believed it was the task of the novelist to listen to their sufferings. Endo didn't rush to impose his patterns on the apostates. He himself entered into the grotesque gospel. And I believe that's the appropriate stance for preachers as well. We also enter into the grotesque gospel by giving up our familiar patterns and our narrative resolutions in order to listen. Listen. We enter the grotesque gospel by caring more for people than for our patterns. Maybe that's the preacher's kenosis, the preacher's participation in crucifixion in a small way. Sometimes we have to be shocked by the grotesque gospel in order to start listening. Several years ago, I was on the campus of the University of Central America in San Salvador, El Salvador. At the center of that campus is a chapel. Some people call it the Chapel of the Martyrs. It sits next to the site where in 1989, 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter were brutally murdered by commandos of the Salvadoran armed forces. The priests were working for peace in the land and justice for the poor, so they were slaughtered. Next to the chapel, there is a memorial museum that tells the story of the martyrs, as well as of many others who were murdered. A copy of Jürgen Moltmann's book, The Crucified God, in Spanish, is in the museum. It is stained with blood. It had apparently been knocked off of a bookshelf when the martyrs were killed, and it had fallen into a pool of their blood. When you walk into the chapel, you face the chancel. It's light, colorful. The center is a large, beautiful cross painted in bright, celebratory hues. Beside the cross are paintings depicting what appeared to me, at least, to be the coming of the Holy Spirit, the resurrection or the ascension. Beside those are 2 large, brightly colored angels. That's what you see as you face the front, as you're listening to the sermon. But when you stand in the pulpit and you face the back of the chapel, you see something very different. All across the back wall are depictions of the Stations of the Cross, all the way across. They are large, graphic, black and white drawings of tortured human beings. Naked, disfigured bodies, contorted faces, gaping mouths. It was shocking to see such figures in a church. I was reminded of how such images have almost become taboo in our sanctuaries. Even though for centuries, churches regularly depicted horrific scenes of demonic activity on sanctuary walls. The pulpit in that chapel in San Salvador sits in a space of unresolved contradictions. One preaches there standing between the beautiful, colorful cross and the graphic black and white images of torture. One preaches poised between death and rebirth, insanity and discovery, rubble and revelation. And in that space, none of my neat, familiar, homiletical theories and patterns would do. And I wonder if many people aren't deep down aching somehow for this grotesque gospel, for preaching that moves beyond predictable patterns into the perilous, paradoxical depths of life. I wonder if faithful preaching of a grotesque gospel requires not clarifications and resolutions, but rather maybe careful descriptions of our complex and unresolved human lives, even if those disturb our familiar homiletical patterns. Maybe that's the place to begin. Last fall, I was leading a class discussion of Claudia Rankine's collection of poems, Citizen, an American Lyric. If you haven't read it, you should. Over and over again, the poems describe the dehumanizing realities of racism, particularly the microaggressions African American people endure on a daily basis. And Rankine uses the second person all throughout the poems. You. So the reader has to identify with these experiences. In introducing the book, I said to the class, this is a very difficult and painful book to read, which it was for me. But later, my teaching assistant was talking to a biracial woman who was not in the class. The woman had read the book. She commented, it wasn't difficult for me to read at all. It was affirming. It confirmed a lifetime of experiences that I've had. Maybe that's the place to begin. Anna Akhmatova was a beloved Russian poet who suffered greatly, along with countless others, through 2 world wars, the Russian Revolution, and especially the Stalinist terror. Her husband was executed, and her son was imprisoned for many years. She herself was persecuted, condemned by the Central Committee to a kind of civic death. Her poems had to be kept alive by people who memorized them. Someone once described her with words that were spoken about Dante. That's the one who was in hell. Her extraordinary poem cycle, Requiem, which deals with the time of the terror, contains haunting echoes of the crucifixion. Years ago, my former colleague Anna Carter Florence, also a Beecher lecturer, introduced me to the short poem that opens Requiem. The poem is entitled Instead of a Preface. It takes place as Akhmatova stands in line with other women waiting for news of their loved ones who have been imprisoned during the repression run by Nikolai Yevtsov, the Soviet secret police official. She writes, in the terrible years of the Yevtsov terror, I spent 17 months in the prison lines of Leningrad. Once someone recognized me. Then a woman with bluish lips standing behind me who, of course, had never heard me called by name before, woke up from the stupor to which everyone had succumbed and whispered in my ear. Everyone spoke in whispers there. Can you describe this? And I answered, yes, I can. Then something that looked like a smile passed over what had once been her face. Can you describe this? And I answered, yes, I can. Then something like a smile passed over what had once been her face. Maybe that's the place to begin. Thank you.